In this video I'll be making a large pair of gates for a driveway as a commission for some friends of ours. First I went over to have a look at the gate posts. These were installed by our friends and they are 6x6 posts, post-created into the ground, and the top part of these holes is yet to be filled, but it will be filled with concrete prior to me installing the gates. And generally, as a rule of thumb, you want about a third of the length of these posts in the ground, and that's how these have been installed. I brought along a spirit level, a tape measure and also a laser measure, and I can check that they are in plumb and they looked pretty good. And then I measured up, and when I got home I could draw up some plans for what I'm going to be making based on those measurements. And I designed the gates based on some pictures that the clients have sent me. And this drawing helped me to figure out how much timber I'd need to buy. So I wrote up a cut list, took it to my local timber merchant, and as this is an exterior project, I went for pressure treated timber. I'm going to use the 2-inch thick stuff for the frame of the gate, mainly because it's less likely to warp or twist out of shape over time. And most of it was very wet, measuring around 35% moisture content, which also made it very heavy. So I stacked it all up with spaces in between to let the air flow through and left it to dry for a couple of months. I ended up wrapping a tarpaulin around it just to keep the rain off, making sure that the air could still flow through. As these gates were needed relatively quickly, mainly to stop a dog getting out from the garden, eventually it got to a point where I just needed to get started. And I'm cutting the framing pieces to length first. This timber measures 150 by 47 millimeters. And I used the first cut piece to mark up the others before cutting them to length too. For each of the 4 corners of the gates I'm going to cut some half-lap joinery, so here I'm using an offcut of the same timber to mark up where material needs to be removed. I line that up with my miter saw blade and then put a mark on the fence to help me position each piece consistently. And I'm going to use the trench cut feature on my miter saw to set the depth of cut, and I'll need a sacrificial board in between the fence and the workpiece to get the full depth of cut all the way across the board. I've just been cutting some samples to see if I can get these half-lap joints dialed in perfectly so that both surfaces are flush, but then I realised that all of these pieces of timber are slightly different thicknesses. That one is 49, 48, 48, 50, 49, 47. So I've decided I'm not going to worry about it too much. This is a gate after all, it's not fine furniture. So I'm just going to set it roughly halfway and cut all of the joints. And if they're not perfectly flush, they're not perfectly flush. I make a series of cuts with the miter saw and then knock out the waste. And I can start cleaning it up with a chisel. This was pretty time consuming, but it's going to add a lot of strength to the gates. After doing a few of these, I found that using the hand plane to cut across the grain was a bit quicker than using a chisel, and it gave me a flatter surface too. And I can use a sharp knife and a chisel just to get right into the corners. So after doing that 16 times, the half laps were done. Time to clean up. I can then position them on the floor just to do a quick test fit, and a few of them needed a little more material removed, which was easy to do on the miter saw as it was still set up. And these look good. I'm using a clamping square for the assembly to help keep them square, or square enough in this case. Thanks, Peter. Here I'm pulling the uprights in tight to the horizontals so that I can take a measurement for the internal width inside the frame, and then I can cut that middle rail too. And I check the fit and it looks perfect. Here I've cut a spacer so that I can position the middle piece spaced equally from the bottom rail on each side, and I can then mark up where I'll be adding some floating tenons, dominoes in this case, on each side. Next I'm using some thinner timber. This is 150 by 22 mil, sold to me as gravel boards, so that I can add an upright bracing piece that I want positioned right in the centre, and I'll use dominoes to secure that too. I made up some 50 by 8mm dominoes using some scraps of white oak because I wasn't sure how well the beach ones that are available to buy would cope with being outside. Maybe I was overthinking it, but better safe than sorry. And anyway, they're pretty quick and easy to make, plus it's a good way to use up some small scraps. For the thicker pieces of timber, I had 2 dominoes referencing from each face to give me 4 in total. I'm using polyurethane glue, which is rated for exterior use, and I'm wearing gloves because this stuff turns your hands black. Don't ask me how I know. And then it was time for the big glue up, and this glue cures pretty quickly, so I had to work fast. I used parallel clamps and some F-clamps on the corners. So I managed to get the middle glued up and one side, but as this glue sets pretty quickly, I think it's 30-minute adhesive, I'm going to leave the other side until later. By this point the glue was dry and it foams up quite a lot, as you can see, so I can clean away the excess. And then I can glue up the other side. And you'll see that I haven't yet glued the top rail on the frame yet, and there's a reason for that which I'll talk about soon. Then I got started assembling gate number 2 in the same way, and these gates are huge and quite heavy, and it was tricky to manoeuvre them around the workshop. So now for that top rail of the frame, and I'm offering it up and marking up where I'm going to add some vertical slats, evenly spaced all the way across. And then I can transfer those marks onto the middle rail using a speed square and straight edge. I cut some more mortises for more dominoes, centered to the thickness of the rails. I gave the inside faces a good sanding while I still have access, and then get the dominoes added. And then I measured up the length for the slats, and for those I'm going to use these 50 by 22mm battens, which I'm offering up to a pencil mark on my fence to cut them all to a consistent length. I gave them a quick sanding on the belt sander just to remove any splintery bits, and then cut all of the mortises in the ends, and I'm not even going to attempt to glue these in place. I wouldn't be able to get the glue on all of them quick enough, and it would be unnecessary too, as the top rail that I'm adding will secure them all in place anyway. And trying to get all of these pieces lined up and seated properly at the same time was a little bit tricky, but I got there in the end. Next I have some more 150 by 22mm timber that I'm going to use for some diagonal bracings to help keep the gate rigid and prevent sagging. I can just offer them up centered to the corners by eye, mark around them, find the angle on the miter saw and cut them at a nice tight fit, because again this timber is wet, so it's unlikely to expand any bigger across the grain than the size that it is right now. These diagonal braces need to mirror each other on each gate, and the braces need to be in compression to transfer the load of the gate onto the hinges. So in other words, this is the correct way to do it, and this would be incorrect. I also added a couple of hidden screw fixings here, drilling a pilot hole and using some long 150mm screws. Here I'm marking up, cutting and adding more of the batten timber, which will give me something to secure the shiplap timber to later. So I'm installing this flush with the braces that I've already added. I used some decking screws to secure these in place. And by the way, the gate is upside down here. I've got it propped up in a couple of notches that I cut into some timber. Next, ideally I wanted to get some pressure treated shiplap to fill the panel at the bottom of the gate, but unfortunately I couldn't source any at any of my local timber or building suppliers. I assume it was something to do with the pandemic. So in the end we had to settle for some untreated stuff from my local sawmill, and that means two things. One, it's going to need some treatment to protect it from rot and decay, and that treatment isn't going to be as effective as the proper pressure treated stuff, but it will be a lot better than nothing. And two, it's going to look very different to the rest of the wood that I've used on the gates so far. But these gates are going to get painted black anyway in a few months' time when the wood is dry enough to paint, so the difference in colour won't really matter then, and the paint will also add another layer of protection to the timber too. The shiplap that I bought was very dry, measuring around 9 to 10% moisture, so it's ready to use and I can start cutting it to length. I bought some of this Sikagard wood preserver, which is a clear treatment, and I poured this in a tub, and it just happened to be the perfect size to fit all of the timber inside. Don't you just love it when things work out like that? I let the end grain soak up that treatment for a while and then rotated all of the pieces to get the other ends. I can also use this treatment on all of the freshly cut ends on the frame of the gate too, just to help preserve them. I then did a dry fit of the shiplap just to figure out how it would fit, and I can then rip the edges off the very first piece, which will be buttered up against the frame. And I'm going to secure these in place with plenty of polyurethane glue and also some galvanized nails, 2 on each end, which I'm putting in by hand as all of the nails available for my framing nailer would have been too long. When I add each board, I'm spacing it apart from the previous one by about 2 to 3 millimeters, just to leave some room for expansion when humidity levels change, as this wood is currently pretty dry. And you'll see from time to time I just offer up a tape measure just to check that I'm installing them straight, as I don't want them going in skewed. When I get to the end, I can mark up where to make a rip cut at the table saw to get that last piece to fit. And here in this shot you can see the gaps that I've left for expansion of the timber. And then I can get a couple more coats of the preserver on both the front and back of the boards. I'm going to leave it there for this one, as this is such a long video already, but in the next video I'll be covering the costs, timescales, and the installation of the gates, which didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped. More on that next time. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe to my channel for more weekly woodworking videos, and if you'd like to help support the channel and get exclusive content, early access to my videos, free project plans and cut lists, and a name credit at the end of my videos, you can find links to YouTube channel membership and my Patreon page in the description box below, or you can make a one-off donation via PayPal. Thank you for watching.